The last road into Crimea is burning. On the night of June 11th, a Ukrainian drone unit found the one crossing Russia still believed was safe, the bridge on the Armiansk highway, that thin neck of land where the peninsula attaches to the mainland, and according to the Ukrainian assault regiment that ran the operation, turned roughly 50 trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition into a single wall of fire. Not a front line, a traffic jam. A column of supply vehicles queued up, nose to tail, with nowhere to go. And that's the part that should make you sit up, because Crimea was never supposed to run out of roads. For 2 years, Russia has been quietly rerouting everything, fuel, shells, men, spare parts, away from the bridges Ukraine kept hitting and onto the ones it hadn't. Armiansk was one of the last on that list. Now it's a crater. Which means the question is no longer whether Ukraine can reach into Crimea, it's whether Russia can still get anything in at all. It's June 17th, and the peninsula that Vladimir Putin has called the crown jewel of the Russian Federation is rationing gasoline by coupon. Hold that thought. This is your host, Alex. If you want the story behind the headline before the headline catches up, take 1 second and subscribe, because this one moves fast. And now let me show you exactly how a country with the second largest military on Earth ended up unable to fuel its own occupation. Start with the geography, because the geography is the whole story. Crimea is almost an island. It hangs off the bottom of Ukraine, connected to the mainland by a few narrow corridors of land and water, and tied to Russia proper only by the long bridge across the Kerch Strait. For Russia to hold Crimea, it has to feed Crimea, and there are really only 3 ways to do that. The first is the Kerch Bridge, Putin's personal monument, opened in 2018, the physical symbol that Crimea belonged to Moscow now. The second is the sea, ferries and small cargo runs across the same strait. And the third is the overland route, the highways and rail lines that snake up through the parts of southern Ukraine that Russia occupied in 2022, through Kherson region, across a handful of bridges, into the top of the peninsula. 3 lifelines. That's it. And what Ukraine has spent the last year doing, patiently, methodically, almost boringly, is closing them one at a time. The Kerch Bridge went first, in a sense. You probably remember the images. October 2022, a truck bomb, 2 spans dropped into the water, fuel wagons on the rail line burning. More strikes followed in 2023 and again last year. Russia repaired it, defended it, wrapped it in barges and smoke screens and electronic jamming. But here's what most coverage skipped past. Even with the bridge standing, Russia stopped trusting it with the dangerous cargo. Fuel tankers, by and large, don't cross the Kerch Bridge anymore. Too valuable, too flammable, too obvious a target sitting on a 19-kilometer span over open water. So the fuel got pushed onto the other 2 routes, onto the ferries, and onto those overland highways through occupied Kherson. Russia adapted, the way Russia always adapts. It found another way in, and Ukraine watched it do that, and then went after the other way in too. Look at the sequence, because the sequence is where the intelligence shows. Ukraine didn't try to hit everything at once. It went after the Chonhar Bridge first, one of the main road links between occupied Kherson and Crimea, a crossing Russia leaned on heavily. Hit it, crater it, force the convoys to find a detour. And then, once the traffic had been squeezed onto the alternate crossings, Ukraine hit those. The pontoon bridges Russia floated in to replace the damaged spans, low capacity, slow, the kind of crossing where trucks have to line up single file and wait their turn. Ukrainian units have said, in plain language, that a pontoon's low throughput is exactly what makes it useful as a target. The trucks queue. They become a line of stationary, fueled, loaded vehicles sitting in the open. And the drones come. That's not destruction for its own sake. That's a trap built out of someone else's logistics. You break the good road so the enemy uses the bad road, and then you sit on the bad road. Over the weekend around June 11th through 14th, Ukrainian forces reported hitting 4 separate bridges linking occupied Kherson to Crimea, crossings near Preobrazhenka, near Mirne, near Stavki, plus the Armiansk road bridge itself. And notably, the damage wasn't only confirmed by Kyiv. Volodymyr Saldo, the official Russia installed to run occupied Kherson, acknowledged the strikes himself. Said specialists were out examining the structures, trying to work out how bad it was. When the occupier's own administrator is the one confirming the bridges are down, you can usually believe the bridges are down. And it isn't only bridges, which is the part that tells you this is a system being taken apart and not just a few crossings being knocked around. On the night of June 13th, while the bridge strikes were still smoking, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces went after the Crimean Titan chemical plant in Armiansk, a sprawling industrial site their commander, Robert Brovdi, the one who goes by the call sign Magyar, described as one of the largest industrial operations in Eastern Europe. It makes titanium dioxide. Sounds like the kind of thing that belongs in paint, and it does. But according to the Ukrainians, the plant's output also feeds Russia's defense industry, into the coatings that go on military hardware. So that's not a random factory, that's a node. A day later, on the 14th, the strikes pushed into the northern neck of the peninsula itself, with Ukrainian assault units reporting the destruction of a checkpoint at Jankoy, a rail and road junction that sits at the heart of Crimea's internal logistics, along with another railway bridge, another pontoon, more trucks. Read those targets in order, and you see the shape of the thinking. The crossings into Crimea, the industry inside Crimea, the junctions that move things around Crimea. It's not a list of opportunistic hits. It's an effort to disassemble the way the whole peninsula functions, piece by piece, and to keep Russia too busy patching holes to ever get ahead of it. Now, I want to be honest with you about the numbers, because this is where a lot of war coverage quietly loses the plot. That figure of 50 destroyed vehicles on the Armiansk crossing, that comes from the Ukrainian unit that carried out the strike. The claim that military traffic on the main overland corridor has fallen by something like 70%, that traces back to Ukrainian commanders, reported through The Guardian. These are interested parties. They have every reason to make the picture look as bad for Russia as possible, and the fog over occupied territory is thick enough that nobody can independently count the burning trucks from a satellite the next morning. So hold those specific figures loosely. The exact tally is a claim, not a confirmed fact. What is confirmed, by Russian officials, by Western analysts, by the actual behavior of the peninsula itself, is the pattern. The bridges are being hit. The routes are being narrowed, and something on the ground in Crimea has visibly broken. Because here's the tell. You don't need to trust a single Ukrainian press release to know something's wrong. You just have to look at the gas stations. At the end of May, the occupation authorities in Crimea started rationing gasoline, 20 liters per car owner per week, bought with prepaid coupons. 20 liters. That's about 5 gallons. For a week. The coupons reportedly sold out the moment they were released on an official messaging channel, and people sat in line for hours waiting to fill up. There are reports of speculators reselling fuel at double the going price. There's a limit now on how much gasoline you can personally carry across the Kerch Bridge in your own car, around 100 liters, because people were turning themselves into amateur fuel smugglers just to get supply onto the peninsula. The authorities set up a hotline, not for the war, for tourists. Tourists who'd driven down for a Black Sea holiday and found themselves stranded because they couldn't buy enough fuel to drive home. And that detail, the tourists, tells you something about how Russia has tried to sell Crimea to its own people. Crimea was supposed to be the prize that proved the whole thing was worth it. The beaches, the resorts, the sense of a Russia made whole again. Last year, the peninsula drew somewhere close to 7 million visitors, and Moscow wanted this year to beat it. Instead, the business daily Kommersant, a Russian outlet, not a Ukrainian one, reported that something like 80% of hotel bookings got canceled across late May and early June. 80%. The crown jewel is having a fuel crisis its own tourism board can't spin away, and the people feeling it first aren't soldiers. They're families in line at a petrol station in Simferopol, watching the number on the coupon and doing the math. So let me reframe what we're actually watching. Because if you think this is a story about bridges, you're looking at the wrong layer. This is a story about cost. Every one of those reroutes Russia is forced into, every detour, every pontoon, every ferry run, every tanker that now has to take the long way around, costs more money, more time, more fuel to move the fuel. A barrel of diesel that used to roll straight down a highway now crawls through a bottleneck, waits for a crossing, risks a drone, and arrives late and more expensive if it arrives at all. Ukraine isn't trying to storm Crimea with tanks. It's trying to make holding Crimea so slow and so expensive that the holding itself becomes the wound. Strangulation, not assault. And the math of that strategy is brutal in Ukraine's favor, because the weapon doing the strangling is a drone that costs a few hundred to a few $1,000s, and the thing it's killing is a fuel truck, or a bridge span, or a day of someone's logistics that can never be bought back. That's the trade that's quietly reshaping this entire war, a cheap machine destroying an expensive one. And it scales. The Ukrainians have a name for the broader idea behind it. They talk about a middle strike, hitting the logistics in the deep space between the front line and the rear, the connective tissue an army assumes is safe precisely because it's nowhere near the fighting. Not the trenches, not the homeland, but the long supply tail in between, where the fuel and the shells and the spare parts are most vulnerable and least defended. Crimea is the perfect proving ground for it, because the whole peninsula is one giant supply tail dangling off the end of a war. And don't forget the third lifeline in all this, the one that's quieter than the bridges, the sea. With the Kerch Bridge no longer trusted for fuel, and the overland routes turning into shooting galleries, more of the burden has been falling on ferries and small cargo runs across the strait. Russia has signaled those shipments would have to ramp up to cover the gap. But ferries are slow, they're limited, and they're not exactly invisible on open water either, in a war where Ukraine has spent 2 years turning the Black Sea into a place Russian vessels approach carefully. So every lifeline degrades the same way. Push the load off the bridge, and the road takes it until the road can't. Push it off the road, and the ferry takes it until the ferry can't. There's no clean route left, only a rotating set of bad options, each one a little worse and a little more expensive than it was a month ago. That's the texture of strangulation, not a single cut, 1,000 small constrictions all tightening at once. Which brings me to the part of this story that the Crimea headlines mostly leave out, the part that connects a bridge in Kherson to the price of the gallon you put in your own car. Because the fuel crisis on the peninsula isn't happening in isolation. It's the southern edge of a much larger campaign, one aimed at the thing underneath everything Russia does, which is oil. While Ukrainian drones have been carving up the bridges into Crimea, other Ukrainian drones have been flying deep, hundreds of kilometers deep, into Russia itself, and hitting refineries. Not oil fields, refineries. The plants that turn crude into the gasoline and diesel and jet fuel that an army actually runs on. And the scale of that campaign is where the story stops being regional and starts being global. Independent analysts estimate that since 2022, Ukraine has struck the large majority of Russia's major refineries, by some counts, around 24 of roughly 33, and knocked out something like a third of the country's refining capacity at various points. Plants in Ryazan, in Moscow, in Nizhny Novgorod, in Yaroslavl, in Kirishi. The Ilsky refinery down in Krasnodar has reportedly been hit more than a dozen times. Reuters reported back in May that refineries across central Russia had been forced to halt or cut output, pushing Russia's crude processing rate to its lowest in well over a decade. And you don't have to take Kyiv's word for that one either. Russia's own Deputy Prime Minister, Alexander Novak, the man who speaks for Russia at the OPEC table, stood up at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum and admitted it. Said, in effect, that yes, oil production is lower than it was at the start of the year, that yes, there are refineries sitting under unscheduled repair. From the Kremlin, that's practically a confession, and the policy response tells you how serious it is. Russia banned gasoline exports starting April 1st. Then it banned jet fuel exports through the end of November. A petrostate, a country whose entire war budget runs on selling energy to the world, voluntarily stopped exporting refined fuel because it needed to keep what it could still produce for itself. You don't do that unless the squeeze is real. Now line that up next to the human detail, and the whole thing snaps into focus. The same campaign that's leaving drivers in Simferopol queuing for coupons is the campaign that forced Moscow to stop selling gasoline abroad. The fuel crisis in Crimea and the refinery crisis inside Russia aren't two stories. They're one story, hitting from two directions. And the Institute for the Study of War, the Washington analysts who track this day by day, have pointed to exactly that synergy. The long-range strikes drain the supply at the source. The bridge strikes choke off what's left as it tries to reach the front. Together, they don't just inconvenience Russia. They start to constrain what Russia can physically do. ISW's read is that continued pressure on these supply lines will likely have knock-on battlefield effects, and could complicate Russian preparations for any new offensive. Translate that out of analysts speak, and it means something simple. An army that can't reliably fuel its trucks can't reliably move. And an army that can't move can't attack. So is this the moment Russia's war machine seizes up? That's the question everyone wants answered, and I'm going to give you the honest version instead of the viral one. No, probably not yet. And the most clear-eyed people watching this are the first to say so. There's an energy analyst, Tatiana Mitrova, who put it about as well as anyone. She'd be cautious, she said, about treating fuel shortages or rationing as proof that some tipping point has already been crossed. Because Russia has had fuel shortages before, even in peacetime, and it has always found a workaround. The point isn't that Ukraine has broken Russia's oil system. The point is that the strikes have become more consequential in 2026, not because the system has shattered, but because the system's ability to keep adapting under stress is being slowly used up. That's the real story. Not a collapse, an exhaustion. Each reroute costs a little more than the last. Each repair is a little harder than the one before it. Russia keeps finding another way, and Ukraine keeps making the next way more expensive than the one it just closed. And that's the concept the Ukrainians themselves keep circling back to, the one that ties this whole campaign together: fire control. The idea isn't necessarily to destroy a bridge so completely it can never be rebuilt. It's to put the entire crossing under such constant, credible threat that the act of repairing it becomes pointless. You send engineers out to fix the span. The drones come back and hit the engineers. You float in a pontoon to bypass the wreckage. The drones hit the pontoon, and the trucks queued up waiting for it. The route isn't gone. It's just no longer usable in any way you can rely on. It exists on a map and nowhere else. That's a different kind of warfare than the one most of us grew up imagining. It's not about planting a flag on the rubble. It's about making sure nothing can ever move across that ground again without permission. The bridge is still there. It just doesn't work anymore. And there's a strange psychological weight to that for the people on the other side, knowing the road home is technically intact and technically a death sentence. Now, here's where I have to complicate the picture, because if I left it there, I'd be doing exactly what I told you not to trust. Because there's a second front in this fuel war, and it's running in the opposite direction from everything I've just described, and any analyst worth your time has to account for it. Look at the actual price of oil this week. As I'm recording, Brent crude is sitting somewhere around $79 a barrel. That's a 3-month low. It's fallen for something like 4 straight sessions, and it's down sharply, by roughly a quarter to a third over the past month. So pause on that. Ukraine is choking Russia's refineries. Russia has banned fuel exports. Crimea is rationing gasoline by coupon. And the global price of oil is going down. Falling. How does that square? It squares because of Iran. Earlier this year, the Middle East lit up, a conflict that pulled in Iran and sent oil spiking, with Brent at one point this past month trading well above $100. And now that conflict is winding down. There's an interim deal between the United States and Iran, reportedly set to be signed in Switzerland on Friday, the kind of agreement that would let Tehran start exporting oil again and ease the choke point at the Strait of Hormuz. The market is pricing that in right now, today, in advance. More than 100 oil-laden ships reportedly waiting in the Gulf, tanker operators repositioning, the International Energy Agency warning of a possible renewed global surplus, U.S. crude inventories drawing down, and the net effect is that the prospect of Iranian barrels flooding back is, for the moment, a bigger force on the global price than anything happening to a refinery in Ryazan. So the global benchmark drops, even as Russia's own fuel logistics burn. 2 fires, pulling the needle in opposite directions, and right now Iran is winning the tug-of-war over the headline number. Which is exactly why you have to be careful about what Russia's fuel crisis actually does to your life, sitting where you are. Because the temptation is to draw a straight line. Ukraine hits Russian oil, oil gets scarce, your gas price goes up. And right now that line is just wrong. The thing pressing on the price you pay at the pump this month isn't the bridge at Armiansk, it's a diplomatic signing ceremony in Switzerland. Crude is still the single largest piece of what you pay for a gallon, more than half of it. So when Brent slides toward the high 70s, that does eventually show up as relief at the pump, all else being equal. But the relief is coming from Iran coming back online, not from anything Ukraine is doing. The Russian campaign matters enormously to the war. To your wallet, this month it's being drowned out by a louder signal. And a good analyst tells you which signal is which, instead of selling you the scary one. But, and this is the longer game, the part that outlasts any single week's price chart, the structural pressure Ukraine is building doesn't go away when Iran's deal gets signed. Iranian supply is a one-time addition. You bring those barrels back, the market absorbs them, and then you're living in the new baseline. The Russian degradation is cumulative. Every refinery that gets harder to keep online, every export ban that strips Moscow of revenue, every reroute that bleeds money out of the system, that's a slow, grinding subtraction that keeps working in the background long after the Iran headline fades. Russia's federal budget is already under strain that would have been hard to imagine a couple of years ago. Reporting earlier this year indicated the deficit ran past its full-year plan in just the first quarter. A country fighting an expensive war on falling energy revenue is a country doing math it does not want to do. And the lower oil goes, thank you, Iran, the worse that math gets for the Kremlin. Because Russia needs a high oil price to fund the very war that Ukraine is using cheap drones to make more expensive. Sit with that loop for a second. Ukraine drives up Russia's costs, while a Middle East peace deal drives down Russia's income. Russia is getting squeezed from both ends at once, and neither squeeze is one it controls. And there's a third hand on the screw, which is the one that runs through Washington and Brussels rather than through a drone workshop in Ukraine. The financial campaign against Russian oil, the price cap on its crude, the sanctions on the so-called shadow fleet of tankers Moscow uses to dodge those caps, the steady tightening of who's allowed to buy what and ship it where, has been grinding in the background this entire time. On its own, sanctions are slow and leaky. Russia has been remarkably good at finding gray market buyers and off-the-books vessels. But stack the financial pressure on top of the physical pressure, and they start to compound. It's one thing to be told you can only sell your oil at a discount. It's another to also be losing the refineries that turn that oil into anything worth selling, and the bridges that move what you keep. Ukraine's drones and Western treasuries are, in effect, working the same target from opposite directions. One degrading Russia's ability to produce and move energy, the other degrading its ability to get paid for it. Neither would be decisive alone. Together they describe a slow vice, and the handle is being turned a quarter inch at a time. So why does an occupied peninsula in the Black Sea matter to anyone watching from a kitchen in Ohio or a commute in Texas? A few reasons, and they're more concrete than they look. The first is the one we just walked through, the energy transmission line that runs from a Russian refinery to a global benchmark to your local gas station. A line that's quiet right now but never actually disconnected. The second is the defense dimension. A meaningful share of the American budget and the American arsenal has flowed toward this war. And how that war is being fought, drones beating bridges, cheap machines unmaking expensive ones, is rewriting the assumptions behind nearly every defense contract and procurement plan in Washington. The Pentagon is watching a country with a fraction of Russia's resources hold ground and project force using equipment that costs less than a used car. And that lesson is going to ripple through U.S. military spending for a decade. Think about what that does to a procurement system built around exquisite billion-dollar platforms. The American way of war has been premised for 2 generations on overwhelming technological superiority, delivered through small numbers of extraordinarily expensive things. The carrier, the stealth jet, the precision missile that costs more than the target it kills. And here is a war demonstrating in real time that a swarm of cheap, attritable, mass-produced drones can impose strategic effects on an opponent that no reasonable budget can fully defend against. You cannot put $1 million interceptor in front of every $1,000 drone. The math bankrupts you before the enemy runs out of drones. That asymmetry is the single most studied feature of this war inside every serious defense ministry right now, and it's already bending decisions about what the United States buys, how much of it, and whether quantity has, as the old line goes, a quality all its own. The contracts being written today are being written in the shadow of a bridge in Kherson. And the third reason is the simplest and the heaviest. This is the largest land war in Europe since 1945, and its direction, whether Russia's hold on the south is firming up or quietly coming apart, shapes everything downstream of it. Energy markets, alliance politics, the risk calculus in a dozen other capitals watching to see whether this kind of slow strangulation actually works. If it does, every contested border in the world just learned something new about what a determined defender with a drone catalog can do. And that, underneath all of it, is what makes this campaign genuinely different from the headlines we got a year ago. A year ago, the story was offensives and counteroffensives, lines on a map moving forward and back, measured in villages and kilometers. This is a different theory of how you win. You don't take the territory. You make the territory impossible to use. You don't beat the army in a field. You make the army unable to get to the field with enough fuel to fight when it arrives. It's warfare as a sustained accounting attack, a campaign aimed not at the enemy's soldiers, but at the enemy's supply chain, his budget, his ability to keep paying for his own ambitions. And the unsettling thing, the thing that should make every defense ministry on earth pay attention, is that it might be the more durable kind. Because you can replace the soldiers Russia loses faster than you can replace the system Ukraine is patiently dismantling. Let me leave you with the texture of it, though, because it's easy to talk about all this in the language of barrels and budgets and forget what it actually is. It's a line of trucks on a narrow bridge at night, headlights off, drivers who know the crossing is watched, idling forward a few meters at a time, hoping the buzzing overhead is far enough away. It's an engineer somewhere on the Kherson side, looking at a damaged span he's been ordered to fix, doing a private calculation about how long he'll be standing exposed on it before someone decides he's a target. It's a family in Simferopol with a coupon for 20 liters and a tank that needs 40. The strategy is cold and the math is clean, but the place where the strategy lands is not abstract at all. And every one of those small, frightened, human calculations is a tiny tax Ukraine is now collecting, every single day, on the simple act of Russia being there. So Russia had one route left into Crimea, and Ukraine found it. The bridges are craters or pontoons or queues full of burning trucks. The Kerch Bridge stands but won't carry the fuel. The ferries are overloaded and the coupons are gone by morning. None of it adds up to a collapse. I won't tell you it does because it doesn't, not yet. And anyone who promises you a tipping point is selling you something. What it adds up to is a peninsula that is becoming, slowly and expensively and undeniably, harder to hold than it is worth. The crown jewel is rationing gasoline. The tourists are stranded. And the Deputy Prime Minister is admitting, out loud, in front of the cameras, that the oil isn't flowing the way it used to. Which leaves one question, and it's the one I keep turning over, because nobody fighting this war seems to want to say it plainly. If you can make a place impossible to supply without ever setting foot on it, if you can strangle a territory from the air with machines that cost less than the trucks they're burning, then what does it even mean anymore to hold ground? Russia still controls Crimea on every map in the world, but control is starting to look like the most expensive thing it owns. And somewhere in Moscow, somebody is doing the math on a peninsula that costs more to keep than it could ever be worth, and quietly hoping nobody asks them to say the answer out loud. This is Professor Alex. I'll see you in the next one.